So this is what they gave me for section 13.
Boring.
Boring, right? Yeah, the environment one was so beautiful and the state power one was so scary. That was my impression too.
I say agency is boring.
Are they trying to make agency boring? Exactly. Well, it brings up something that I talked about a week ago, which is the issue of when somebody says, remember, we talked about anthropology of the state, and I still think observation, which state, is still one of the more hilarious things, which is also true. But something similar happens if I'm just going to say, hey, we're going to do anthropology and agency. What's your first thought? Which agency are we doing? I think that in some ways, I'm not sure about this, but the word agency, I feel like I do hear it more, a little bit more in popular culture to mean how people act, that they have agency. When I started talking about agency, when I started teaching, nobody had heard it. Where have you heard it outside of anthropology, or have you?
I've definitely heard it described for people, the person's agency.
Right. I'm trying to think how that came to be. Because, like I said, 20 years ago, if I said agency, yeah, they would be the Social Security Agency. But now, yeah, it's that people's ability to do something in the world. But I don't know how that happened that I've heard it outside. This came into anthropology as part of what was called, speaking of boring, a long-running debate between structure and agency, which was people got worked up about, and then it wasn't, I don't know, I'm still confused about it. But I would say about this is if we go back to what early anthropologists were saying about culture, if you look at Ruth Benedict's patterns of culture, on the one hand, as I've been insisting, it was supposed to be this moment in which we realized that our learned behavior, the dynamic process by which we learn things and change in the world, is more important than, say, biological determinism or the determinism associated with sex determinism, you might say, as in biology. However, as anthropology developed, it seems like people got more and more interested in those patterns and the structuring of culture. It was always there, but it seems to have become more and more important as anthropology tried to become more and more scientific and find its place in the academy, rather than just being a point against some of the things that were happening in society. So you had movements or ideas in anthropology, like the idea of structural functionalism, or and that was associated maybe with Radcliffe Brown and Malinowski over in the UK, or the idea of structuralism, which is associated mainly with Levi-Strauss. But in both instances, or in all instances, although they were very different from each other, you can see how in some ways people are talking about the ways in which patterns, those structures kind of determine people's lives. And so we were losing that idea of dynamism and change in favor of these ideas. Now, we talked a couple classes ago about Bourdieu's work, which was really an attempt to bring in the idea of how people are acting in the world. They're not determined, but nevertheless, their actions reproduce the system. And so trying to figure out how much agency do people have? How much ability do they have in the world to make change or to just do what they want to do, and how much are they determined by the social structure, the powers that be, culture. I want to start with Victoria Redcliffe's article, in part because Redcliffe's article brings out these issues perhaps to the fore. I think that the reason that she is using so many quotes and cites of other people is that she is talking about something statelessness and citizenship. And so she says these, quote, dehumanized individuals without any political system to offer them protection have been the subject of a growing body of scholarship and increasing academic concern. So the reason she's quoting all these people is because there's been this production of works about people who are in a state of statelessness, who don't have citizenship, or is in camps, or have crossed a border, or have applied for a political asylum, who have no state. And what she's saying here is that most of the portrayals, most of the academic concern has said that they are in this regime of statelessness in which they are reduced to abject, bare life, human superfluity. And so while the academics and others have looked at people like this, basically the betrayal of people in this state has been that they have no agency, right? That there aren't agents at all. And one is tempted to be concerned with people like that because they have no citizenship, they have no state, they're unable to do anything. However, what she is looking at is the actual lived spaces of statelessness across the world. And when you look, Tori, at what they're actually doing there, the firsthand accounts, the lived spaces, what's going on in these camps? What's actually happening there? Are they entirely abject, just bare life living, can't do anything? It's not the best. It is pretty bare, but she quotes somebody who says some people do move out of the camps and they do get some form of mobility. Sometimes they do get citizenship cards and these kinds of things. And so they get mobility, as you mentioned. The issue of getting an education and schooling is going to be an issue. But what she's trying to say is that people that live in these camps are not entirely, they're not completely subjugated, so they have no agency themselves. They are able to have some mobility, some movement, and they are influential actors in their own way. And so when we look at these issues of statelessness and citizenship, if anything, these are going to be huge issues. We're going to hear about them more and more. This is going to be an enormous issue. She's also saying that they are no longer, or they aren't just helpless pawns. And so we have to look at them when we do look at people like that. Portrayals of them as simply helpless victims, have no agency at all, are not going to need to be adjusted. That you have to look at people's capacity, even in this time of increased statelessness. So again, this article helps to give us perhaps the dimensions of the debate, right? Are people's lives entirely structured from the outside? Or do people, even in these conditions in which they would seem to be completely unable to do anything, actually are able to get at least some mobility, movement, and become political actors in their own way? Our second article by Shalini Shankar, Speaking Like a Model Minority, Fob styles, gender and racial meanings among Desi teens in Silicon Valley. It's about how these teens are trying to make their identity here. Ideologies of multilingualism that prevail in South Asia. People in South Asia often like to be multilingual. Travel with their speakers to an increasingly monolingual California. California, they like to be monolingual. We in America like being monolingual. We don't like multilingual people. And such an ideological clash is managed differently by upwardly mobile, well-educated desis and by middle-class families who have prospered from the tech boom but remain in assembly line jobs. So Shankar's article is about the people who are working in this industry, but they're not the upper class. They're more in the middle to lower range of things, and they're going to high school there, and they adopt what she calls a fob style. That's really interesting because being fresh off the boat is often taken as a pejoratively, right, as an insult. But the people that are adopting these styles, they said they're second or even third generation who are adopting this style for their own in-group conversation and to mark themselves. So she says that it's a combination of Punjabi. They also, though, sometimes use some Spanish, which was super interesting. So at one point, is on page 370, they're talking to each other. They're not speaking Spanish to Spanish speakers, but it's like, no habla inglés. Like, I don't speak English. And then everybody laughs because they use it. It's like as she says, they occasionally speak Spanish in a school environment where they are routinely mistaken for Latinos. They use Spanish as a way to mock faculty who cannot easily differentiate between them and Latinos. They don't actually know much Spanish or speak Spanish with Mexican Americans and other people who speak Spanish. They use it to make fun of people who can't tell them apart from Spanish speakers, which is an interesting use of Spanish for sure. They also throw in some California slang and some rap expressions, but she says that fob styles incorporate lexical elements from hip hop without any political or social interest in Black people. So it's basically an entirely in-group designation. It's not trying to cross over or assimilate or blend. And so what she calls this kind of language idea, she says they are made fun of as being, the stereotype is that they are loudly code switching in Punjabi, but she says this is a Desi accented English, or DAE, a language variety which teens index insider humor. It's not an accent, it's a way of distinguishing themselves from their other people around them and knowing who they are. What they are doing then is using language to shape the way that they are perceived, or to language use and shaping racial meanings in diasporic communities. So they are part of a larger diaspora, and they're using quite cleverly language in order to shape their interactions. In some ways, in this school, though, then they are not seen as acting in the ways that models should be done, and they might be seen as acting in reform. Yeah. So Mahmood, the subject of freedom. Not sure if this was the hardest one to understand or not, but Mahmood really just jumps in there and tells us that oftentimes when we think about agency or the capacity to do something, what it has been used as is as resistance to the overall structure. Agency in this form of analysis is understood as the capacity to realize one's own interests against the weight of custom, tradition, transcendental will, or other obstacles. And so basically what Mahmood is saying is that it's like, if we go back to the beginning, that structure has been opposed to agency. So whenever we say somebody has agency, it's like you're able to do what you want against these obstacles, whether that be custom or tradition or transcendental will. And she was looking at this women's Islamist movement. There it is, the Islamic revival and the feminist subject. Then you would say, oh my gosh, here we have, for the first time in the history of Egypt, an all-woman movement inside a mosque. And so perhaps as a feminist, you might get excited about that. But she says you shouldn't get excited about that, because in fact, it's an all-women's movement in order to reinforce pious norms of the Islamic religion. And so she's looking at, in some ways, perhaps similar to what Bourdieu was saying, but even more potently, what she's saying is that when people are exercising this agency, that it's not necessarily resisting, and that it actually can be a quite conservative or normative force. And so she says on page 365, agentival capacity is not only in those acts that resist norms, but also in the multiple ways in which one inhabits norms. And so she's trying to get us to look differently at the concept of agency as not just something that is against or resisting, but as something that can actually be part of the imposition of norms. So she says at the end, I am not interested in offering a theory of agency. She's saying she's not trying to make this theoretical intervention into this debate and tell us what agency is. She's more interested in the ways in which it's been harnessed to various movements and ideas within the academy, which doesn't let us see what's going on out there. And so she says here that the concept of agency should be delinked, unlinked, separated from the goals of progressive politics, a tethering that has often led to the incarceration of the notion of agency. Wow, what a phrase. Within the trope of resistance against oppressive and dominating operations of power. So she's saying, hey, we should look at how people are exercising agency, but that doesn't mean it's going to be part of the realm of progressive politics. I was really interested in this article right now because when people are looking at the contemporary student protests, there's this whole group of people who are blaming the professors for radicalizing you. How's that been working out? Have I been radicalizing you? Were you radicalized by reading these articles today? Did you want to go out and do something? Yeah, I'm actually confused by this because I'm just happy when we do the work. That's good. Anybody who's been in a classroom recently knows that students rarely do anything that I tell them to do. So I don't see how I could be radicalizing anybody. And even if we read an author whose last name and name people might be, aha, there it is. Saba Mahmood, a feminist. She's saying that we have to de-link the concept of agency from the goals of progressive politics. That doesn't sound very radicalizing to me. It sounds like the opposite, right? It's like, oh, there you go. We're gonna do something completely different. So anyway, just checking. Yeah, I didn't think so. Nobody's gonna do anything because of me, that's for sure. Didn't work.